We'll start week 4 talking about nitrogen fertilizers. Really, this is going to be the first time that we kind of dive into some fertilizer sources. So it's worth defining what a fertilizer is. And obviously, it's any material. It could be organic or inorganic, natural or manufactured, mined, created, etc., that is added to soil to supply essential elements to that plant, right? And so this idea that soils in our modern cropping systems, or for whatever reason, a soil might not have enough of buffering capacity and be able to supply that crop with enough nutrients for the high harvest rates that we often encounter. And so fertilizers are intended to replace those nutrients, so we're not just continually mining nutrients from the soil and reducing the overall fertility of that soil. So it's important to kind of distinguish between organic versus inorganic fertilizer. We touched on this already a bit, but organic meaning that it's got this carbon backbone. That is, it's in a form of natural organic matter, so to speak. And inorganic has no carbon molecule, so it's something that is, from a chemistry perspective, an inorganic form. Okay, there's no carbon associated with it. So besides the kind of the difference on thinking of it in carbon, we can think of these organic versus inorganic in terms of having large differences in their behavior and the ability to manage them. And so with organic fertilizer sources, the form typically is much more complex. Many different varieties that might be, that we can encounter. These forms are often less available to plants and require some sort of nutrient transformation to become plant available. So last week we talked about this process of mineralization that needed to occur for an organic nitrogen to become inorganic, i.e. into ammonium, the nitrate, etc. So this is exactly kind of what we're talking about here, but not specific to maybe nitrogen, but just at a little bit higher level. So the content or the concentration of a nutrient in an organic fertilizer source can be highly variable. And then ultimately the behavior of that nutrient in soil, because it often requires or is influenced by microbial and environmental factors, it's more complex and difficult to predict exactly when that nutrient will be available. Okay, so that's a major difference. We go to inorganic or mineral fertilizers, and it's kind of the opposite. The form is by design, by manufacturing process, to be the majority of that is in a very available form, ready right now for crop uptake. Requires little to no nutrient transformation to make it plant available. The content is known because it's listed. You buy a fertilizer and it tells you exactly how much N, P, or K might be in there, right? And then the nutrient behavior in soil is often more predictable. So when we, not to say there's trade-offs to both using both sources, of course, economics and blah blah blah. But in terms of kind of from a management perspective and being able to predict, the inorganic fertilizer certainly makes life easier from a nutrient management perspective because it's a more of a known quantity. Okay, we'll get into more of this as the course progresses. So, not the most important slide in the world, but just kind of good to know why we're providing this little introduction to fertilizers in general. This idea, you might hear these kind of terms thrown around, but there's straight grade fertilizers, that is fertilizers that just contain one plant nutrient, 0060, 8200, for example, so it's just N or just K or whatever. There's mixed grade, which contains 2 or more, so and these are common in industry. And then there's complete grade. You don't hear this used that often, but these are contain all three macronutrients of NPK. So like a 12-12 or triple 19, for example, these would be considered a complete grade. So what are these numbers? Well, the nomenclature that's commonly used, and you'll find this, if you go to the hardware store, if you go to the any place that's selling fertilizer, whether it be Home Depot or a co-op, you'll have these three numbers with dashes that typically separate them. So it's NPK, but more interestingly, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So it's actually N to P2O5 to K2O. Okay, so an example again, triple 12 or triple 19. What that means, or if this example of Miracle Grow, again, you could pick this up at the hardware store. 24, 18, 16. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that for every 1 pound of product, every 1 pound of Miracle Grow contains 0.24 or 24% pounds of N, 8% or 0.08 pounds of P2O5, and then again 16% or 0.16 pounds of K2O. So why isn't it just straight NPK and it's this P2O5 and K2O? Well, we'll get a little bit more into this, but this is really kind of the fertilizer industry standard. And so phosphorus, when you buy phosphorus fertilizer, unlike nitrogen fertilizer, you buy nitrogen fertilizer, it is a concentration of elemental N. That is N by itself. But for P and K, it's this pentoxide, this P2O5, and K2O. Okay, so it's a little bit different, and it's not straight elemental P, it's 2 P's and 5 oxygens. So it's a little bit, from an elemental perspective, it's diluted down with these 5 oxygens. So it's just one of these things that, is the kind of the standard, and it might not make perfect sense, but it's just what's used and has been used for a long, long time. So we can think about fertilizers in the context of liquid versus solid formulations, and then there's of course pluses and minuses with this. Liquids can be soil applied, injected, or foliar applied. They can be solutions, which are true fertilizer in water, right? It's in some kind of clear liquid, more uniform, or it can be a suspension, which is kind of in solution, but it can fall out, so you might need to agitate it or to mix it before you apply it. Of course, solutions are often preferred, but suspensions can be cheaper, so that's why they're used. Solids are often the cheapest form or source because it does not contain water, so it's more concentrated. It's not in the solid or liquid form that has water, and then you don't have to transport that water with it. Solids can be broadcast or banded or injected in some specialty scenarios. Pellets, prills, mine salts, evaporated salts, crushed lime. So there's a lot of kind of jargon that goes around fertilizers, pellets versus prills versus crushed, etc., etc. So pellets are really manufactured, and they have a more uniform kind of spherical structure. Prills are they're called that because they're just these globulates that they're called prills because they are prilled from a prill tower essentially, and they're just kind of, think about them as like a liquid form that's drying, cooling and drying, and then kind of forming these amorphous globs. But it's a little bit cheaper to produce a prill than a pellet typically, so that's why those things exist, etc. And then we can just think about crushed or kind of powder type form of fertilizer. So there's a lot of different ways that these types of things are manufactured, and they might exist as well. Okay, so getting into nitrogen specifically. We talked last week about the Haber-Bosch process, and that really NH3, that is ammonium, is the true building block for nitrogen fertilizer. And we can see that this anhydrous ammonium, and in case this isn't coming out over the speaker, NH3 is ammonia, which is it's ends in an A and not the UM, right? So NH3 is anhydrous ammonia, and it's really the building block for all N fertilizer, right? So this is a simplified drawing, but essentially if we take NH3 and we combine it with sulfuric acid, we can get ammonium sulfate, common nitrogen fertilizer. If we combine it with nitric acid, we get ammonium nitrate. If we combine it with water, we can get UAN and urea solutions. With carbon dioxide, urea itself. And then with phosphoric acid, we can get ammonium phosphate, such as MAP and DAP, these mono and di and polyammonium phosphates, which are our most common phosphorus fertilizers. So you can see here that, and we'll talk about all of these fertilizers, the nitrogen fertilizers coming up here in a second, but this idea, this anhydrous ammonia, which is really the final product or the main product of this Haber-Bosch process, flows into and becomes essentially the building block of all nitrogen fertilizer that's manufactured. So we can't understate its importance, right? So worldwide uses of ammonium. Ammonia can be turned into urea, ammonium nitrate, other fertilizers, and then here we see about 20% of this is, on a worldwide basis, is used for, well, maybe 25% for non-fertilizer sources. So the vast majority of this is produced to manufacture nitrogen fertilizer or other types of fertilizer that has nitrogen in it, and just kind of a small percentage of this goes to other maybe non-ag sources. So just looking at the trends in the United States in general in terms of the type of fertilizer that's used, and we can see really, so this isn't coming out super well, but we have, starting at the bottom, these solid triangle and squares is ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. Okay, so not huge sources of nitrogen, but then we move up and we've got urea as these open squares, and we can see urea has increased in popularity, really starting since like the 80s. It's gone up and up. Anhydrous ammonia has been holding steady as these triangles. And then UAN, which I don't know what these are, circles or half circles or something, but UAN has become really and continues to become more and more popular as the fertilizer of source. And so we'll get into each one of these here in a bit, right? But it's kind of interesting to see this, especially when you think about UAN as a fertilizer and some of the drawbacks to that. So lots of different nitrogen fertilizers that are out there that, depending on the purpose and the manufacturer, this is a table from that Haviland textbook. And you can see that some of them have nothing but nitrogen, and then plenty others have, are mixed grades that have phosphorus or potassium or calcium or magnesium, etc., etc. Also, just remind you that different fertilizers impact soil acidity differently, and so this can be a very real consideration for growers when they're deciding what they want to use, right? And we talked about things like ammonium sulfate, which might acidify the soil. For every mole of nitrogen, might acidify the soil twice as much as some of these other, say, urea or anhydrous, etc. So for every nitrogen molecule, do you need to buy 1 mole of nitrogen? Do we need to buy 1 mole of lime or 2 moles of lime equivalent, right? Okay, so let's get into some of these. Anhydrous ammonia This is essentially anhydrous, meaning it does not have water in it, right? And so 82%, 8200, that's really what it is. It's the highest nitrogen um, concentration nitrogen of all fertilizers because it's really the most purest form of N. The other 18% are these three hydrogens that we need. It doesn't nitrogen in nature doesn't exist just by itself unless it's in this dinitrogen gas. So it's manufactured. It's a gas under ambient conditions, but then it's put under pressure and put in liquid. Okay, it's often the cheapest source of N, but really the decision to use anhydrous is often driven by availability. And you can go to some counties in Ohio, and most people are using anhydrous, and then you can go to the next county over, and there's very few people using it. And oftentimes that just comes to supply and infrastructure, and if there's a manufacturing plant that's close by. And so if you drive by a co-op, you can often see what might look like these propane tanks, even on trailers or by themselves. And these are really, I mean, it's not propane, but it's anhydrous ammonia that's been pressurized into a liquid form and stored in these tanks. Okay, and you can even see in the springtime, these applicators moving across the field and making applications with this anhydrous ammonia on the back, right? Just as the nitrogen source that's getting applied to the soil. So the disadvantages of ammonia is the handling application. So if you've ever sprayed, say, Windex and got a whiff of it, that's really ammonia, that ammonia smell, and that can be really strong and very unpleasant. Imagine that, but 10 times more concentrated, or even 20 times more concentrated, depending on the form, right? And so it's a pressurized gas, needs to be handled very, very carefully, and it needs extra safety precautions. It comes out, it can present serious. If it comes in contact with skin, it can cause burns, and if it gets in your eyes or lungs, it's even worse. And so it just needs to be people handle it and without problem, and there's lots of safety precautions that are there, but it's just important to note that. Also, ammonia is toxic to seedlings and soil microbes, and so it really is a sterilizing thing because it's coming out in such a strong concentration. And what happens is that it's coming out as anhydrous. It immediately reacts with water, and it forms ammonium and then this hydroxide, right? And it jacks the pH way up because this is it drives the pH if it's acidic to neutral and then above. And because of this kind of sterilization process, it works in our favor in the context of reducing nitrification, reducing the conversion of this ammonium to nitrate rapidly, right? So anhydrous is often called it's knifed in. It's usually run with the applicators, and we saw, here we can see it. This is an applicator that's folded up, and for transport, these applicators, these pictures aren't very good, but it's the same idea where we've got, say, maybe a coulter or opener, and then here's that knife apparatus with the tube and the opening port that actually makes that's where the anhydrous is coming out again as a liquid, and then the minute it hits ambient pressure, atmospheric pressure, it turns into a gas. Okay, so this is a really kind of the crux of managing this fertilizer source, where if you're not if the applicator, that knife, isn't deep enough, or the moisture isn't right, when it turns to a gas, it can get lost quite readily. and so we just need to have some proficiency in terms of this application. When that anhydrous hits the soil, if the soil pH is say 6.5 and is optimal, it can increase that banded zone to say a pH of 9 in a split second. Within a few weeks, that pH drops as the ammonium is absorbed to CEC sites, and nitrification is converting that ammonia, and i.e. ammonium, into nitrate. Soil moisture is really important when we're applying anhydrous. Retention is better in moist soils with high clay content. If we're talking about moisture, too dry soils and too wet soils, regardless of if it's a sandy or a clay soil, is bad. We need essentially a good soil moisture. But sandier soils are more prone to loss than heavier clay soils. Okay. So here's just a little bit of data, just showing different depth placements of the applicator: 3 inches, 6 inches, and 9 inches, and how that's driven by soil moisture. So, and then this is percent loss. So you can see the moisture, when it's placed, say, at 9 inches, has very little effect on the actual loss of ammonia. And so again, going back, I don't think I specifically said this, but when we're talking about loss in that gas of ammonia, that's actually the volatilization that we talked about last week, right? So 9 inches, soil moisture doesn't affect it, but once we're at 6 inches, when its soils are really dry, we can see greater losses than when they're a little bit wetter. And then when we're in a shallower 3-inch band, we can see that moisture really affects the loss potential. Okay, so a rule of thumb is 12 to 20% moisture. That's kind of field capacity-ish, or maybe a little bit less. And we try to inject anhydrous, knife it in no less than 6 inches. 6 to 8 would be kind of minimum. Some people go deeper than that even. And you will, if you see a scenario like this, you will smell it before you see it. But if there's ammonia that's getting lost in the gas form because that soil is not sealing properly, this is an extreme example where you can actually see that gas vapor, but again, you're going to smell that before you see anything because it's a very, very strong odor. So this is the ideal scenario. If we want it to seal, we want that applicator to get knifed in and apply, and then we've got this banded nitrogen form. Too shallow or too wet, you get problems. That's demonstrated here in these pictures. Okay, so urea 4600. So this is actually a granular fertilizer. It's typically prilled fertilizer. It's the highest nitric content for a dry fertilizer. It's relatively inexpensive. It's easy, safe to use, to store and to blend it. We can dissolve it rapidly in water. It's no issues to do that if we want to move it through irrigation or through mix it with other liquid fertilizers. One of the biggest problems with urea is, again, this idea of prone to ammonia volatilization. This is particularly true on alkaline soils and sandy soils. And so if we're just going to surface apply, we often like to band it or we like to incorporate it. That's, one of the rubs with urea as well. So conversion of ammonia and loss as a gas, right? So this is worse when there's high temperatures. We have high application rates, high sandy soils, and high organic matter or crop residue. This is what what we talked about last week with volatilization. So this idea of this conversion process of taking urea mediated by a urease enzyme and getting volatilization that happens, right? So it's really a two-step process. First, you get ammonium, and then ammonium volatilizes. So this is not what we want. We want to manage this to the extent that we can to minimize volatilization losses, right? And this is true of all the N fertilizers that we're going to talk about today. So our goal is to reduce volatilization. We can do this by surface applying in cold soils before a rain, or incorporate after we do some kind of broadcasting event or banding it, right? So then finally we can use urease inhibitors, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. So urea is commonly found in a dry fertilizer, but it can also come in a urea ammonium nitrate liquid form, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But all of them have similar potential to volatilize and having end loss that way. So that's kind of the main take-home point with urea, that we just need to be able to think about this and be able to manage for that. Okay, so UAN, urea ammonium nitrate, often called UAN, comes in 28% or 32% formulations. 28% is by far the most common that you'll find in Ohio. That means it's 50% urea, 25% ammonium, and 25% nitrate. So it's a relatively concentrated form, but it is in a liquid form. Okay. UAN Advantages is that it's easy to handle and apply. We don't have to keep it under pressure, and we don't have risk of burning or like we do with Anhydrous. It's adapted for this idea of weed and feed, and this is common in kind of field crops where people will mix essentially their fertilizer, the UAN, with a herbicide application, so in a liquid form, and they'll go in and as kind of a side dress or as a pre-emergent, post-emergent side dress or a pre-emergent before that seed actually emerges from the ground, they will essentially fertilize and spray an herbicide at the same time. Okay. Again, that's a surface application, so you have chance of loss in that regard, but it's a practice. I wouldn't say it's not like everybody does it, but there's people certainly in the state that do that quite a bit. Advantages that you don't need specialized equipment like Anhydrous. It's less hazardous. You can apply large volumes rapidly, and it's easy to mix. Okay. So the disadvantages is that if you surface apply it without an inhibitor, it's subject to loss, and that's true with a lot of these N fertilizers that we're talking about. It's only 28%, and it's got water in it, so that requires heavier loads on the field. More potential for compaction, and just more diesel fuel that you're hauling water. So you need to use more fuel to actually move that throughout the field. And then if you're doing applications, there's potential for leaf burn because UAN is it's got a large salt index to it as well. Okay. Ammonium sulfate is an additional nitrogen fertilizer source. It is ammonium plus sulfate, so it's got 24% sulfur, 21%, sometimes 20 nitrogen. It's a granular fertilizer. It dissolves readily in solution and again acidifies soils more than any other N source that's commonly used. And so the advantage is that it comes with sulfur. The disadvantage is that it is a strong acidifier as a nitrogen fertilizer. Okay, so I just put this in as a kind of a summary of the four most common N fertilizers that you'll see or encounter in the state, and what they're commonly called kind of in the industry. Anhydrous, Urea 28, and then ammonium sulfate, or AMS, is a little bit more common. People call it AMS. Here's the actual percent nitrogen that it exists, and then here's the form. Anhydrous, it's really handled as a liquid, but when it's applied, it's a gaseous form. And then urea and ammonium sulfate is our granular fertilizers, and UAN is our liquid fertilizer. But there are other fertilizers out there, things like ammonium nitrate, 3400. This used to be a very common fertilizer that was used. Balanced source of ammonium and nitrate, soluble, not easily volatilized. It's a nice product, but the problem is that it's explosive, and because of the fact that it can be used for malfeasance, and has been in the past, unfortunately, restricts access, and it's actually quite difficult to get and to use these days. And so a lot of people don't want to bother with that kind of added burden of the regulatory process of this, and so they moved away from that. There's also things like calcium, sodium, potassium nitrate. So these are fertilizers that contain nitrate. Nitrate as a fertilizer, of course, is very plant available, but also very susceptible to leaching, very mobile in soil. So these are not acid forming, typically, because of the nitrate in that nitrate form already. And large deposits of things like Chilean saltpeter, i.e. sodium nitrate, or potassium nitrate. These are things that are mined. Sodium nitrate is, at least for now, is a common nitrogen source in organic production because it's mined and not manufactured. It's quote unquote okay, but there's a lot of people that don't like the nature of how it's a mined product that's not a non-renewable fertilizer source, and it's likely, at least in how I'm reading the tea leaves, that this is not going to be a OMRI approved or a product that's going to be allowed in nitrogen organic production in the coming years. So, but these things, because they're mined, are typically a little bit more expensive. Might be more common in, like, say, horticultural or specialty crop scenarios where there's some fertigation that occurs, that calcium or potassium, the crop might use calcium or potassium in higher quantities, and so it might have that added effect. But in field crops, you're not going to see a lot of this being used. And then, of course, there's lots of nitrogen fertilizers that come in organic forms: manures, poultry, compost, etc., etc. And these supply lots of nitrogen, phosphorus, lots of nutrients that plants need, but just the proportionality of N versus P versus K can vary by source and by handling, etc., etc. So we'll get into, I'll just mention this now because we'll get into it more in a few weeks when we really dive into phosphorus. But, it's common in systems that utilize manure for application of P for phosphorus to be over-applied and built up in soils. So constant application of manure, especially when it's applied at rates to meet nitrogen demands of crops, can often load phosphorus. And this becomes a huge challenge to manage phosphorus and manage manure in general. This idea that we're over-applying phosphorus and building soils up with very high levels of P, and then of course that means that that phosphorus, those soils with high phosphorus loads, are more likely to lose phosphorus over time. Okay, so because of the fact that these organic fertilizer sources have that carbon backbone and require transformation, they're often, we can think of them as not all immediately available. We might apply apply 100 pounds of N, but maybe only half of that's available over the course of the first growing season, the first 3 or 4 or 5 months. So it's a slow release fertilizer in that regard. Okay, so those are that's all I have. Those are the main forms of N fertilizer sources that are used, and we'll get in next into kind of talking about enhancing some of the efficiency or the performance of those fertilizers.